So again, Romans 8:24, we're going to be talking about a theme which is basically that grace is from beginning to end. The church is called to embody that same grace in community. And so I'm going to make a point based on tenses. Okay, so we know tenses are past, present, future. So this is going to be absolutely riveting because at 10 a.m. on a Sunday morning, I'm sure you want to hear all about word tenses. But in Romans 8:24, and I'm just going to kind of pick from a few different verses, and you're going to hopefully hear what it is that the author is trying to say, where it says, "For in this hope," notice, "we were saved." Now, I have an ESV, but I'm sure almost that all of you have a past tense translation here regardless of if you're using the KJV or you might be using a different Bible. In this hope, we were saved. Now, that again, I just want to camp on that just for a second, okay? And just point out that salvation is something, the Bible points out, that has already happened, okay? It's crossing from death to life. It's crossing from darkness into light. The Bible describes salvation at times past tense. But it doesn't just describe it past tense. It also describes it, ready? Future tense. All right. Romans 13:11. If you want to turn there, go ahead. I'm going to have it here on the screen for you. But it says there, "For salvation is nearer to us now than we first believed." Now that's interesting. The same word, salvation, is used, and by the way, it's the same word in Greek, is used of a future thing that's going to happen. What's going on there? If salvation is in the past, how could it also be in the future? So I think what the author is trying to make the point of is that salvation in some sense is still ahead, and it's nearer than when we first started. So I'm going to make this one last point. Which tense do you think I'm going to make right now? If I talked about past and I talked about future, present tense. All right. Thank you for the two of you that are paying attention. Philippians 2:12, it says, and this is a really interesting one, especially for people who are either hyper-Calvinist or people who are hyper-Arminian or Wesleyan. Sometimes they do not like this verse. Philippians 2:12, and again, I'm kind of intentionally just taking parts of it, where it says, "Work out your salvation with fear and trembling." That seems to suggest that salvation is something now. So again, here's the point, okay? Salvation is something that's past, okay? We were saved. Salvation is something that's present. We are being saved. And salvation is something that's future. We will be saved. Now, we could even put it theologically, and I've talked about this in the past. I gave you a biblical studies point of view, but I've talked about from a theological perspective in the past. Past tense salvation is called justification. God justifies us like a forensic declaration of righteousness, like a judge saying you are not just not guilty, you are innocent. Then there is sanctification, that's the present tense, that's the ongoing one. And then there's the future tense, which is glorification, okay? But here, I just want us to focus on all grace. Grace is operating at every step of the way. Salvation's not a one-time thing. Salvation's an ongoing process. And to maybe help you understand this a little bit more, I want to turn to the example of the Exodus, okay? So for the Jews, before Jesus came on the scene of human history and before we had the New Testament, the Old Testament that we have, the Jews would have looked at salvation and they would have defined it as the Exodus, okay? So the Exodus was such an interesting event, and right here, I don't know why, but my thing is reconnecting. So even technology is demon-possessed right now. I'm not sure what's going on. But anyways, if that doesn't work, then maybe, Mary, you could do the slides for me. Thank you so much. All right, so when it comes to the Exodus, what happens in the Exodus is that salvation is it's God knows, He hears the cries of the oppressed Israelites like almost right away when they pray. But when were they saved? Was it when they were actually, when God called Moses? When were they saved? Was it when the first plague happened? And God said, hey, I'm serious about this, let my people go. When were they saved? Was it when the 10th plague happened and Pharaoh finally relented and let them go? When were they saved? Was it when they went to Mount Sinai? We have to ask the question when they were saved. And it also is interesting to think about that salvation in that case was past tense, was present tense, and was future for them. So, and I'm going to pull up here there we go. Should be coming up here just in a second. All right, perfect. Okay, and so if there's all these different tenses going on, Jesus also does this really cool thing in the New Testament where he meets people where they are at. He meets people along the road of grace, so to speak. And so he drops into people's lives regardless of where they're at on that journey. And I want to take us to a very famous passage, okay, so I can illustrate this point even more. Now, this is actually from Luke chapter 18. This is starting at verse 18. Again, you don't have to turn there. I'll have it here on the screen for you. But this is a very familiar passage with the rich young ruler. And so this is a person who has prominent status. He's coming up to Jesus, and he comes up to Jesus, and he says, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Now, again, we sometimes miss this. We sometimes don't know what's going on in this passage because we read it through the lens of familiarity. But this was actually a very common question to ask rabbinical leaders. So there are rabbinical leaders around the time of Jesus that were very well known, that were very prominent, and they would have been asked the same question. And it would have told the person asking it where that particular rabbi was on certain issues. It's kind of like how today, if you ask someone, "Hey, can you lose your salvation?" it tells you a lot about their theological presuppositions. Does that make sense? So he's coming up to Jesus, and we're not sure of his motives here. He really could be asking genuinely, but he also could be testing, as so often was true with what happened with Jesus. He was almost always tested. And Jesus said to him, "Why do you call me good?" Which is, again, a very rabbinical way to answer. If you notice, Jesus almost never answers a question with an answer. He almost always answers a question with a question. So it's very frustrating, but it's also really intriguing because he's such a genius. He says, "Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. You know the commandments. Do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not bear false witness, and honor your father and mother." Now, very quickly, the 10 Commandments are divided into two parts. I'm sure you know this, but just by way of review, there's commands about God, and there's commandments about neighbor. So what Jesus does is he quotes all the commands about neighbor, but he leaves out one. Which one did he leave out? Well, let's go on in the passage. He says, "All these I have kept from my youth." And it's kind of like, well, wait a minute, dude. No way, okay? Nice try, but probably not. But when Jesus heard this, he says to him, "One thing you still lack, sell all that you have and distribute to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come and follow me." What's the one thing that he was missing out? What's the one thing that Jesus omitted? Do not covet. Do not covet. And so when Jesus knew, because he's such a genius, he knew that that was the one sin issue that he had. He knew that even though God's grace was still operating in this guy's life, and I don't mean a salvific grace, by the way, but God's common grace was operating in this guy's life, that even though it was there, Jesus met him where he was at. And Jesus exposed the one, I'm sure many, but one of many sin issues, but at least the one that was holding him back. The one big thing that was preventing him, because it says, "But when he heard these things, he became very sad, for he was extremely rich." In other words, Jesus knows where we're at. Jesus knows the operation of grace that's in someone's life, and he meets them where they're at. Now, Jesus, thankfully, when it comes to us, okay, so we've looked at how salvation and grace can be past, present, and future. We've seen an Old Testament example of that from the Exodus. We've seen a New Testament example from that, from the rich young ruler. But now I want us to apply it to ourselves. Aren't you so glad that when Jesus found you, he didn't expose every single sin at once? He's so gracious that he points out what's holding us back, and he invites us further along. No, okay, so I've told you this story like a million times, but it's kind of weird. I look back at pictures from like 2019 and even 2020 when I was deployed, and I was running like a lot. I was running constantly. I was spectacularly mediocre, clawing my way to the middle. I was not in any way impressive, but I was a lot skinnier. So I was like 40 pounds lighter. Now, I have worked very hard and like force-fed myself things that aren't very like appetizing but like are good. And I've been working out really hard to gain those 40 pounds. So it hasn't been like ice cream and hamburgers or whatever. But one of the reasons why I wanted to do that is because I wanted to actually learn how to get stronger. Now, I have a strength coach who's really good. He's really good at what he does. He's an elite Olympic lifter. So he's not just a buff guy in the gyms with big biceps. He's a really good lifter, and more importantly, he's very good at communicating things about that. And so one of the things that he does whenever I'm learning a new lift is he gently says, hey, man, here's the one thing that's holding you back. And you got to understand, I am the antithesis of athletic. I don't have an athletic bone in my body. I wish I did. I don't. But he'll say to me, okay, so you see this one technical thing. He'll break down my lifts, and he'll say, this is your problem. If you can work on that, you'll progress. But the funny thing is, there are 30, 40, 50 issues wrong. There are all kinds of things that are holding me back. But he knows the one thing that's holding me back, that if I can change, I can progress to the next level. And he doesn't just say, you're a hopeless slob. Like, go back, I don't know, I cannot help you. He says, no, here's what you need to do to change, to progress to the next mark. Here's what you need. And I am grateful for that. In some ways, I know that's an imperfect analogy, Jesus is like that. He is so gracious, he is so kind, he is so humble, that when he sees one thing holding us back, he'll meet us along the road of grace, and he'll say, here's what needs to change. Now, I want us to think of this in terms of a continuum. Okay, so this is hardly very novel, but let's just say that some of us are on this particular continuum, and we've been walking with Jesus maybe 20 years. Who knows, maybe 30 years. We might be farther along. We might be at D. We might even be at E. But here's the thing. What happens sometimes is the farther along in grace that we get, the more we forget what it was like to be at A. Does that make sense? And we forget that people who start out at A are really raw. And sometimes smell like the sulfur of hell. And I'm not like being literal here, but it's like, I know that there are some times, especially when I'm helping out my soldiers, right? There are some times where they will say, man, that was a bleep of a sermon. And I'm like, normally you wouldn't say that. I guess I'll accept that. I really appreciate it. Or, you know, and the thing is, it doesn't even like dawn on them that they maybe shouldn't say that. They've never stepped foot inside of church, and they're having their first encounter with Jesus. I remember one of the first times that someone came to me and he said, this is the first time. We were deployed, and so it's dry over in the Middle East, at least where I was, and there's no alcohol. He said, this is the first time that I've been sober for over a week. I've been shaking for the last few days. I think I'm in withdrawals. But he wept about how he's finally able to receive the message of Jesus. Now, he was so raw. He was making mistakes left and right. But did I treat him like he should be at E? Absolutely not. It was enough to get him to A, just to step foot inside the chapel, just to talk to me. And so we are all on different roads and a different part of the continuum. We are all on different avenues in the spectrum, and Jesus meets us where we're at. And he's gracious, and he'll point out the next thing that we need to go to move from A to B and from B to C. And sometimes when we go to C to B, back to A, he's gracious enough to say, no, you're going the wrong direction. Come with me. It's over here. But so often, I'm sorry, was someone, thank you. We can talk in church. Amen to that. Absolutely, yeah. But truly, I'm grateful that as a church, we want to be the kind of people who are gracious to people on this continuum. Because it's so easy for us to forget that there are certain things that we should stop doing. This is why Paul, when he's describing the way that Christians should act, uses these really cool words. He talks about taking off certain garments, not just so you're naked, but so that you put on other garments. The taking off is something that Jesus has already done and is helping you with, but you're in the process of taking them off more. and you're putting on or donning other garments. So it's not only a subtraction, it's an addition. And the church is supposed to be there for people along the way, just like Jesus is there for people along the way. Because grace is operating not just ahead of us, but behind us and in the midst of where we're at. Now, did you think, just for a minute, that I could get away with preaching a sermon without a C.S. Lewis quote? You were wrong if you thought that. All right. This is one of my favorites. I've quoted this so many times, but I cannot think of a better analogy. He says in Mere Christianity, I want you to imagine yourself as a living house. God comes in to rebuild that house, and at first, you can understand what he's doing. He's getting the drains right, and he's stopping the leaks in the roof, and so on. You knew that those jobs needed doing, and so you're not surprised. But presently, he starts knocking down the house in a way that hurts abominably. And it doesn't seem to be right or to make sense. What on earth is he up to? The explanation is that he's building quite a different house than the one that you thought of. Throwing out a new wing here, putting out an extra floor there, running up towers, making courtyards. You thought you were being made into a decent little cottage, but he's making a palace, and he intends to come and live with it himself. That's such a good quote. That is so powerful. Because if you think about it, we can be those kind of people who are like, hey, man, I'm in process. I'm under construction. But you, as I talked about last week, you should know better. Come on. It's easy to give ourselves this grace and to say, hey, this is just what happens. But to extend that same grace, to see that, you're on a different part of the continuum, man, that's totally different. Now, I want to make the point, once again, that grace is through the whole journey. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to make a very basic point. And you were going to say, Michael, if you have a spiritual gift, it is to overmake a point, and I will receive that word. But I want to just take you very quickly to Romans 3:23 through 24. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified, again, past tense, salvation, justification, justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Jesus Christ. All right. Now, this is kind of interesting, because here we're talking about a different tense. Therefore, Romans 5:1 says, since we have been justified by faith, we have, present tense, peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Through him we've also obtained access by faith into the grace in which we stand. In other words, like present tense, this is where we're at. We stand in it. And we rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. Now, the last scripture, if I talked about present and if I talked about past and present, I'm going to talk about future now. And this comes from a great book, the book of Titus. For the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation to all people, training us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions, to live self-controlled and upright lives in the present age. So, I should have said this one is actually present tense. Excuse me. And then, this one's interesting. Grace through the whole journey as exemplified in Hebrews 10:14. Okay? For by a single offering, talking here about Jesus, he has perfected for all time those who are being saved. See, salvation, again, is all through the journey, past, present, and future. Now, I can't help but think that this is what Paul wants to convey most earnestly to his listeners and to his readers in the church in Ephesus, where he says in Ephesians 4:1, I, therefore, a prisoner of the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you've been called. Now, very quickly, I love this passage, and it's easy to become familiar with this as I talk about it, but the first 3 chapters of the book of Ephesians, the only command that Paul gives, and he's big on giving imperatives, which are commands, the only command that he gives is to remember. That's it. Just remember. That's it. And he talks about how you have been seated in heavenly places with Christ. He talks about how we've been predestined, how we have been adopted, how we have been infused with righteousness. He talks about all of these beautiful things for 3 chapters. And all he says is, I want you to remember. Remember who you are. And then he begins chapter 4 with this same verse, which if we don't remember the context, which is that God has done all these things through Christ. Okay, not that this impresses you at all. Okay, but in Greek, these are all aorist passive verbs, which means they have been done to us. They have been done to us. We didn't do a thing. We didn't do anything to warrant this. We didn't do anything to merit it. We don't deserve it. It has been done to us and for us. And as a result, Paul transitions now and says, as a prisoner of the Lord, I urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called. Now, again, we can look at this and we can say, oh, I know what that means. Walking worthy means I need to earn it. Yep, okay, check, I'll do that. I need to do my nice deeds for the day, I'll earn it. And that is precisely not what it is supposed to mean. To walk worthy means, and the Greek word there is axios. That's where we get the word axiomatic, like self-evident. It's like, no, you're already this, now become this. Now again, I know that it looks funny that I'm wearing army pajamas here, okay? But here's the funny journey about at least a chaplain, okay? For chaplains, and there's also some other jobs in the Army, you are usually a direct commission. What that means is that other jobs, like if you want to become usually an officer in the United States Army, you have to go through a specific kind of schooling. And you earn your commission either through ROTC, okay, which is like people in college usually do that, or you earn your commission by going to going to like a commissioning school, or you can go to West Point, which is like pretty elite. Now, all these people earn these things. All I did was had the right requirements for the United States government and a pulse. And they were like, cool, all right, we need chaplains. We don't care if you believe in Jedis. Like, you know, and of course, thankfully, I'm at least somewhat squared away with the scripture. So I commissioned, I raise my right hand, I do the oath, I'm a lieutenant. Like, I'm a lieutenant, like, right away. I didn't do anything to earn it. I don't even know how to march. I don't know how to salute. I know nothing. And yet, the rest of my career is walking worthy to the calling to which you've been called. That's what I'm supposed to do. So instead of just walking like a goofball, and like, you know, I try to, as much as I can, have what's called proper military bearing, which is correct etiquette, and making sure that I can speak Army just as well as I'm a pastor. I am not just a pastor in a camouflage suit. I am a chaplain, which is a staff officer. Now, I'm not saying I take like pride in that, like but I say that because I want to become, as Paul says, all things to all people. So my job is not to earn becoming an officer. I'm already an officer. I just need to act like one. Axios. So walk worthy of the calling to which you've been called. Same thing with every other calling in your life. You guys, I'm sure, who are parents, remember when the nurse or the doctor places the baby in your arms? You're a parent. Do you have the slightest idea about what it's like to be a parent? Absolutely not. And yet, the rest of your parenting life, which is forever, is becoming the parent that you're supposed to be. And in the same way, in Ephesians 4:1, when Paul says, remember, for the first 3 chapters, and lays out all the things that God's done for you, in chapter 4, verse 1, what we're supposed to do is walk worthy of that. Not earn it, but walk in a way that shows that you are what you were called to be. Now, it's grace the whole way. And listen, if you are a recipient of grace, why is it so hard to give grace to other people? Again, I didn't earn it, but why is it so hard to give it out? I think it's because we miss the fact that body life like this is really hard. It's really difficult. It's so difficult to rub shoulders with people who are different from us and who have different personalities than us and who are on different iterations on the continuum. They're maybe at C and you're at B, and all the C's want you to look like C's, but really the D's over here, man, that's where it's at. You guys don't know. We're the better ones. We're the cooler ones. We're over here, but then you're just an A, and so and you just get all over the place. But never forget that the New Testament has a whole bunch of one another's. I feel like I'm talking about Greek a lot today. But when I first learned Greek, one of the ways that there's a really great professor, he actually came from APU, which, side note, usually doesn't produce a lot of great professors that are right on. And says the guy who goes to Fuller. Fuller is just a mess anyways. All right. So APU produced this guy. His name's Bill Mounce, and his dad actually was a prolific scholar, wrote a fine commentary on the book of Revelation, just a great New Testament scholar. But Bill Mounce came up with a great way to learn New Testament Greek for pastors. And one of the ways that he did it is based on the frequency of words that occur in the New Testament. And so if you memorize the word kai, which is the word for and, you know a third of the New Testament. It's pretty cool. Well, anyways, he organizes by frequency. So one of the first words that I learned in my first week in seminary was the word allelon, which is actually the word for one another. And the reason why I went into that whole story is because it occurs frequently through the New Testament. It was one of the first words, so that every time that I saw allelon, I was like, I don't know what anything else means, but I know what that one means, and it means one another. Now, the reason why that's significant is, why would there be so many one anothers in the New Testament? Because Jesus and Paul and John and Peter and whoever wrote Hebrews, they all have to say, hey, be nice to one another. Forgive one another. In fact, let's just do a little sampling, shall we? Romans 12:16, live in harmony with one another. Romans 14:13, stop passing judgment on one another. Romans 15:7, accept one another. Romans 5:21, submit to one another. Romans 12:10, outdo one another in showing honor. Isn't that a great passage? In other words, hey, one-up each other, but not one-up each other in hey man, you know I'm more godly than you, right? That's lame, and that's not Christian. But to outdo one another in hey, I just blessed you in a way, and I'm so excited to see what God's going to do with that. Not in a way to pat myself on the back, but in a way to bless you. Outdo one another in showing honor. Notice this one, bear with one another. Why would Paul have to write that in in Colossians, if we were all, going back to the continuum, on E? If we were all the farthest along. The only command would be, hey, congratulate one another on being awesome. That's the only command that would exist in the New Testament. But as far as I've read it, and I've read it a little bit, I've never seen that command. You know why? Because we're all in process. We're all along the way of grace. So, friends, we forgive one another. We encourage one another. And in a great way, this is one of my favorite one another passages in Philippians 2:3. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others, or I could say one another, more significant than yourself. I love this passage, but I hate to practice it. I hate it. You know why? Because I'm more important than you guys. Well, I'm not. I'm teasing, right? But that's the way that we think. That's the way that we operate. So when I do nothing from selfish ambition, which that would cut out a lot of my behavior right there, and I count others more significant than myself, I am in some ways emulating God and emulating Jesus. Because that's what he did, right? That's how he operated. And that is the biggest thing that he did. And so, brothers and sisters, I just want, before the take-home truth, I want to just offer this, okay? So I heard this story, and when I heard it, it actually came true for me, all right? So here's the story, okay? And this was from a guy I knew, and I was like, I don't know. He kind of has a tendency to exaggerate stories. He said that a professor told him in a graduate program, so this was not an undergraduate class, like a throwaway class, the professor told him, hey, you know you got an A. So the next paper that you write, I'm going to give you an A, regardless of the paper that you wrote. Can you imagine that? I really would love to have a professor like that. Here's the crazy thing. It actually happened to me. I'm not even joking. It was crazy. Now, it was because I had a good grade going in, and I actually could have done whatever like on the paper, and it still wouldn't have affected me. But I'm so like OCD. I'm like, oh, I have to do it perfectly, that I was like, no, I got to get this right. But the teacher finally told me, hey, you got an A. So like, just like, you're good. Don't worry about it. Now, in the story, what happened to this person was that the professor who said this, they were actually, they told him, like, again, anything that you write, I'll give you an A on. And so is it possible, then, that the person could have written, Dear Professor, this is my paper, I demand an A, love this person. I mean, they could have done it, right? But they didn't. And in the story, or so it goes, he says it was the best paper that I've ever written. It was the best thing that I've ever written. You know why? Because I had the freedom to be able to express myself. Now, in my case, I was like still like furiously, because I'm like OCD and very broken. But either way, I mean, I got an A on the paper. That's all that counts. But here's the thing, though. I want us to think about this. We've all, through grace, got an A. Now we need to live A lives. Does that make sense? Like, we've all got the passing grade from Jesus by virtue of his sacrifice, not by virtue of anything that we've done. We do not merit anything based on our actions. And yet, to glorify him through our actions is living an A or an A-plus life. And here's the thing for the people, okay? God's people are called at times to say, hey, man, that behavior is not in keeping with an A lifestyle. And there's nothing wrong with that. But here's what we're not called to do. You deserve an F. Because only Jesus gives the grades. We can point out grammatical inconsistencies, and I'm so grateful that Sarah does that really well. She'll say, you put 2 ands here. I'm like, no, I didn't. And I read it, and I'm like, oh, yeah, I did. And. You know, I guess I was stuttering at the time. I don't know what it is. But we can point out inconsistencies. We can point out fallacies. We can point out grammatical errors, but we're not to assign grades. Only Jesus does this. So, how can we be the kind of people who extend grace to those in Jesus who live A lives? We need, I think, to remember that salvation is a journey. It's a journey of grace from the beginning to the end. And because of that, we need to be a community of grace at every single step. Never forget, grace is not just something like, oh man, I messed up, like, and God's somehow behind me sweeping it. No, grace is with me now, and grace is even ahead of time. And so live lives worthy. Live A+ life.